Kerala, the Malabar coast. In the 17th century, this was not some distant outpost. It was the crossroads of oceanic trade and philosophical depth. Temples functioned as banks, palaces consulted astrologers, and across the palm-shaded backwaters, a quiet power moved beneath the surface. To outsiders, it smelled of pepper. To its own people, it pulsed with something older: dharma, order, rhythm. In 1684, Captain John Brabourne arrived on these shores, an emissary of the British East India Company. He came with gifts, silver coins, velvet, sweetened words. He came not as a conqueror, but as a courtier. And in the Rani of Anjengo, Umiyama, he found both a sovereign and a strategist. She ruled through a matrilineal system, as had queens before her, strong, calculating, and politically astute. She saw Brabourne and the company not simply as guests, but as leverage. The Dutch were growing overconfident. The British, still junior players in the region, could be useful pawns, a new counterweight in an old game. Some say Brabourne seduced her, literally or politically. Either way, in 1694, she granted the company rights to build a trading factory in Anjengo. But what rose from the sand was no ordinary factory. The British built fast, too fast. Walls of laterite stone, embrasures for cannon, imported guns. This was no trading post. It was a fortress. Provocation. Inside the Rani's court, alarm bells rang, but so did conflict. Kudum Pillai, one of her most trusted ministers, urged restraint and suspicion. He warned that the British came not just for pepper, but for dominance. He saw early on that they did not understand the land they had entered, or worse, did not care to. But he was not the only voice at court. Vijayamuthu Pillai, ambitious, pragmatic, and hungry for power, welcomed the company's influence. Where Kuduman saw desecration, Vijayamuthu saw opportunity. He assured the Rani that the British could be managed. And when she, growing wary, ordered the construction to be halted, it was Vijayamuthu who betrayed her. He tipped off the company, giving them time to arm themselves. The Rani sent soldiers, the company fired first. On the 27th of July, 1694, Anjengo was declared a full company settlement. Umiyama Rani died in 1698. Her daughter succeeded her, young, isolated, and surrounded by those who now served British interests. The balance of power was shifting, quietly, irrevocably. Meanwhile, pepper continued to flow, outward. Bought at 5 rupees a quintal, sold in London for 500 rupees. What was profit for the company was poverty for the cultivators. Nair landowners, Ashava farmers, Muslim traders each felt the strain. Rituals were disrupted. Land was annexed. The promise of partnership had become the practice of plunder. The fort still stood, but the foundation beneath it, dignity, consent, balance, had begun to erode. This was not yet an empire, but the signs were clear. The rituals were breaking. The arrogance was spreading. Inside the fort, officers drank wine over stolen profit. Outside, Kudum Pillai watched, waiting, calculating. The powder was laid. The fuse was smouldering. After the death of Umiyama Rani in 1698, The balance of power on the Malabar coast shifted once again. Her successor, politically weaker, younger, and hemmed in by ambitious ministers, struggled to command the same loyalty or fear. Yet the fort at Anjengo remained, its stone walls growing thicker, its company presence growing more brazen. What followed was not order, but chaos. Between 1698 and 1717, Anjengo became a graveyard of ambition. British officers called factors came and went. Some died of tropical disease, others were quietly removed, recalled for incompetence or corruption, but a few simply refused to go. One officer dismissed from his post barricaded himself inside the fort, trading on the company's coin while contesting his own removal. The East India Company's Anjengo station had become less an administrative outpost and more a lawless frontier, a cutthroat marketplace of ambition, where officers forged records, sent false reports to Bombay and fought one another for power. Why? Because for the right man, it could make you rich. This wasn't civil service, it was opportunity, with death at the edges. Trade became manipulation. Local pepper merchants were cheated with false weights, underpaid and overtaxed. Temple lands were quietly annexed. The promised tribute to the Rani, 17,000 Panams annually, equivalent to a substantial fortune at the time, was neglected. And all the while, reports to Bombay glowed with tales of improvement. The days of diplomacy were over. John Brabourne, who had once brokered the original Anjengo agreement with tact and ceremony, was long gone. He had built the fort, but did not live to manage its decay. By now, a new generation of company men had taken over, more aggressive, less restrained, and increasingly blind to local consequence. The court at Attingal, once cautiously cooperative, had grown resentful. Kudum Pillai, still a keen minister, now saw the British not as guests, but as invaders in disguise. And so, in 1717, the company dispatched a new chief, William Gifford. He was young, ambitious, and politically connected, a man they hoped could impose order and restore profit. But Gifford brought not stability, but escalation. He arrived with Catherine Gifford, his wife, his partner, and in many ways his mirror. William Gifford had built his reputation in Bombay, where rumour and record both tell of forged contracts, private trades, and unauthorised use of company funds. Anjengo, under his leadership, became his personal enterprise. Orders from Bombay were ignored. Rivals were undermined with slanderous letters and doctored ledgers. Gifford knew how to play the company and how to profit while pretending to serve it. But if William was corrupt, Catherine was incendiary. She arrived in Anjengo like a queen in a captured court, sharp-tongued, cold-eyed, and utterly dismissive of the land and its people. She refused to speak directly to locals, mocked their dress, laughed at their prayers, and openly referred to Kerala's culture as heathen pageantry. When Muslim merchants came to negotiate trade, she ordered children to pelt them with filth, watching with amusement as they tried to keep their dignity intact. Even British officers noted her contempt, but none challenged it. Within the fort, her word was final. Catherine seemed to thrive where others faded. Even as men around her fell to fever, mutiny, or madness, she held her place at the centre of the storm. Dismissed by none, feared by many, she became something more than a company wife. She became a symbol. At the heart of this regime stood Ignacio Malheiro, Portuguese Catholic and the company's official interpreter. Fluent in Malayalam and English, he controlled every word that passed between the British and the people of Attingal. But Malheiro did more than translate. He manipulated. He whispered of rebellion, of insult, of treachery. He fed Gifford's paranoia with tales of conspiracy, often exaggerated, sometimes invented. And outside the walls, he sowed confusion, distorting decrees and feeding anger. Meanwhile, the economy rotted. Pepper, still bought at 5 rupees per quintal and sold in Europe for over 500, flowed through a system increasingly rigged. False weights, bribery, debts unpaid. And then came the final insult. A Brahmin priest, outraged at the seizure of temple land by company men, protested. In response, Gifford ordered him to shave the beard of an untouchable. An act of social violation, so severe it destroyed the man's standing. His wife, shamed beyond consolation, threw herself into the backwaters. He followed soon after. This was not ignorance. This was calculated humiliation, spiritual desecration as demonstration of power. And still in the court of Attingal, Kudum Pillai watched, quiet, controlled, remembering. He had warned the Rani's court years before. Now he began to act. To the British, things were back on track. Profit was up, the cork was quiet, the pepper was moving. But they had misunderstood silence. Outside the walls of Anjengo, the land remembered. Humiliation does not disappear. It ferments. And the price of that contempt was already drawing near. By 1719, something beneath the quiet rhythms of Kerala had begun to stir. The monsoon still came, temple drums still beat, but behind the rituals, in the shade of the groves and courtyards, a different drum began to sound, a slow, deliberate pulse of resistance. Kuduman Pillai was moving. He didn't raise a banner, he didn't make a speech, but the signs were clear to those who knew where to look. Supplies began to vanish. Pepper that once flowed to the fort no longer arrived. The ox carts stayed in the hills. Porters disappeared. Labourers melted into the shadows. Even interpreters grew suddenly mute. This was no rebellion, not yet. It was a withdrawal, a tightening of breath, a strategy of absence. Kuduman began to build a network, not of rebels but of resistors. Among them, the Nair aristocracy, insulted and sidelined by company arrogance. Among Eshava cultivators whose livelihoods were being siphoned. Among Muslim merchants shamed and humiliated by Catherine Gifford's displays, and among the Brahmin priests whose sacred order had been mocked. Each had a reason, each had a memory, and under Kuduman's quiet leadership, each began to pull away. But in the palm groves and mud-walled villages, another force was gathering, the Kalari warriors. Born of Kerala's Kalari Payatu martial tradition, these warriors were not soldiers of the crown. They were guardians of land and lineage, trained in swordplay, staff combat, and Mama nerve point strikes. Their bodies were weapons. So were their minds. From a young age, they studied not only combat but breathwork, Ayurvedic healing, and yogic discipline. They lived by codes older than empire, codes that tied the body to the cosmos, duty to the soil. In older days, they served kings. Now they answered only to Dharma. Kuduman did not summon them. He didn't need to. The insult to land, temple, and honor was cruel enough. And so they began to move, quietly, practicing under moonlight, carrying messages through jungle paths, preparing not for war, but for the moment war would come to them. Their presence meant something deeper, that the very body of Kerala was preparing to defend itself. Inside the walls of Anjengo, the British officers barely noticed. Gifford, increasingly irritated, listened as Maliero spun tales of Brahmin sedition and Muslim threats. But to him these were familiar fictions. Trade was tight but not broken, the fort still stood, the Union Jack, or the company flag, still flew. He mistook silence for surrender, but Kuduman Pillai knew better. He understood that power without legitimacy is a castle on sand, that culture cannot be conquered with ledgers and flags, that a land, if mocked long enough, remembers. And he understood this. The resistance does not always arrive in force. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet, in the stopping of a cart, the stillness of a priest, the sharpening of a sword. There is a moment before every turning where history holds its breath, and Anjengo was nearing that breath's end. In April of 1721, William Gifford made a decision that would alter the course of company rule on the Malabar coast. He resolved to revive a long-neglected tradition, presentation of tribute to the Rani of Attingal. Once a ritual of respect, it had been allowed to lapse. Gifford, hoping to steady relations and affirm control, sought to restore it with grandeur. Not a letter, a procession. On the morning of the 11th of April, the gates of Anjengo Fort swung open. 120 company men stepped out, accompanied by an equal number of coolies. Behind them followed factors, merchants, interpreters, and baggage trains. Banners flew, drummers played what Biddulph calls a country tune, a melody alien to the coconut groves and temple lands they passed. But the power on display was largely theatrical. The men carried no live ammunition, only powder enough for ceremony. From the beginning, things felt off. Pula Vejimuta Pillai, one of the court's key intermediaries, was conspicuously absent. Drunk, they were told. Cows, Gifford's subordinate, smelled trouble and urged retreat. Gifford refused, struck Cows across the face by one account, threatened imprisonment. Hubris does not hear when it believes itself in control. Even the Rani herself sent a discreet message, return to Anjengo, but the delegation pressed on. At the palace, they were received with warmth. Musicians played, courtiers bowed, perfume scented the air, and the gifts, cloth from Surat, silverware from Bombay, bundles of spice wrapped in silk, were laid out with reverence before the Rani. 7 years of missed tribute, wrapped in one performance of reconciliation. For a moment it worked. There were smiles, grace, even laughter. Gifford believed it had been enough. To affirm the moment, he ordered a ceremonial volley, final gesture of goodwill, fired by men carrying just enough powder for the salute. But no shot, no bullets, no reserves. The coolies had already removed their supplies. The smoke rose, empty of threat. The display was impressive, but the illusion had now fully overtaken the reality. In empires, moments like this arrive quietly, when ceremony replaces conviction, and the rulers are the last to feel the ground shift. As evening descended, the company men were invited to stay the night. It would be impolite to refuse. They were led respectfully into a small enclosure, fed, thanked, honoured. Then the tone shifted. The crowd returned, but changed. Smiles faded, words disappeared. Weapons began to reappear in the hands of their hosts. Gifford sensed it, too late. He dispatched a letter to the fort, directed to Captain Sewell. Captain Sewell, we are treacherously dealt with here. Therefore keep a very good lookout on any designs on you. Have a good look to your 2 trankers. We hope to be with you tonight. Take care and don't frighten the women. We are in no great danger. The message trailed off. Perhaps he was interrupted. Perhaps he still believed his own theatre. And so, as the Vishu firelight flickered through the trees and cicadas rose into the dark, the men of Anjengo lay down in what they thought was peace. They had come bearing gifts, but the land was already done receiving. Night had fallen over Attengal. The Vishu celebrations had quieted. The company men lay down in the small enclosure, their gifts given, their bellies full. They believed they had done enough. Then came the silence, the kind that sharpens the edge of every sound. Then came the knives. From the trees, from behind the walls, from within the crowd they emerged. The Kalari Payatu trained warriors, joined by farmers, traders, priests and porters. This was no mob. This was a message. They moved swiftly, efficiently, not with rage, but precision. Throats slit, arrows driven into bellies, clubs smashed through skulls. The company men didn't stand a chance. They had no powder, no arms, no plan. Some tried to run, some begged. Many never stood at all. Accounts of what happened next differ. One survivor claimed Gifford had his tongue cut out, nailed to his chest, and was then crucified, floated downriver, a colonial martyr, grotesquely mirrored against the image of Christ. Another said Ignacio Meliero was tortured, disemboweled and still alive when handed to the mob, his intestines trailing in the dust. Biddulph reports that out of more than 120 men, only 10 or 20 survived, and they bore the marks, arrows embedded, saber cuts across faces and backs, up to 20 wounds each. They staggered back to Anjengo as visions, more spectre than man. One hid for days in the river beneath a basket. Another walked miles with a pierced lung. None would forget. And so it was that diplomacy died, not in argument, but in firelight and blood. The company, so sure of its ceremony, had mistaken spectacle for safety. The land had watched them march in with flags and drums, answered with silence, and then steel. What do we call such a moment? A massacre? A revolt? A betrayal? Or is it something older? A reply. Back at Anjengo Fort, the first rumours of what had happened began to trickle in. Half heard, half believed. The gates remained open, but hearts began to close. Inside, the garrison was thin, a scattering of clerks, invalids, and barely trained. The company had not expected war, and Catherine Gifford, reading her husband's final broken words, did not rally troops or order cannon fire. She did what survivors do. She gathered the company's books, secured what coin she could, and looked for a way out. In the coming days, the siege would begin, not just of a fort, but of an entire illusion of control. Catherine's story, like the company's, would be one of retreat, endurance, and consequence. The fort at Anjengo was never built to endure a siege. It was meant to impress, to store pepper, house company men, and project strength. But by April of 1721, that illusion had already cracked. Garrison was a skeleton crew, 35 men at most, invalids, clerks, pensioners, the dregs. Biddulph calls them not 20 of them fit to hold a firelock. And now the storm was coming. The survivors of the tribute party, bleeding, gasping, had barely staggered through the gates when the scale of the catastrophe began to register. Gifford was dead, cows too, Maliera dismembered, the survivors mutilated. Nothing of the procession remained but agony and rumour. Among those still standing were storekeeper Robert Sewell, Lieutenant Peter Lapthorne, Ensign Thomas Davis, and Gunner Samuel Ince. Of them, only one would rise to the occasion. Catherine Gifford, now widowed a third time, read her husband's final note and moved with sharp precision. She gathered company records and cash, secured the ledgers, and tried to convince Lapthorne to join her. When he refused, she left him with instructions and boarded a small country vessel bound for Madras, along with Mrs. Cowes, her 4 children, and Mrs. Burton with 2 more. She passed through the dangerous Anjengo surf, carrying not grief, but strategy. All that remained of her property, Lapthorne later wrote, were 2 wigs, a bolster, and some opium. Back in the fort, Samuel Ince took command, not by rank but by force of will. There were no supplies. The roofs were made of palm leaf, fire hazards. The rains came down, then the sun, then the flies. They had no surgeon, no carpenter, no ammunition stores worth the name. The trankers, the outlying defences, had to be abandoned. Still, Ince led men to dismantle flammable roofing, salvaged rice and fish from the warehouse, and secured what treasure they could. Sewell and Lapthorne? Drunk. Plundering company stores, sending goods out through friendly ports, their men followed suit, looting rooms while the fall buckled. Ensign Davies, wasted by illness, died in July. The enemy didn't launch a full assault, not at first. Instead, they fired flaming arrows, hoping to burn them out. Women and children huddled in corners, nares shouted from the trees, rain poured through the open roof. Then in late June came the real attack, 3 sides at once. From the river, from the trench, from Cowes' old house, now held by the enemy. Ince rallied a party. They were repulsed once, then returned hurling grenades through windows, clearing the building as enemy fighters jumped into the river, some drowning in panic. Ince then turned his guns on the entrenchments and beat them back. No English were killed that day, but they fought with the weapons of their own dead, captured after the massacre. There was no glory in it, only survival. Through 6 months of siege, Ince kept the fort standing. With no surgeon, no food relief for weeks, no reinforcements until late July, he held together what was left of a broken outpost. Eventually help came. 2 small ships from Cochin, then 51 men from Calicut. Finally, in October, Mr. Midford arrived with 300 men. The Rani sent Brahmins to apologise, promised peace, and in time the siege ebbed. But what remained was ruin. Samuel Ince had done the impossible. The fort stood, but barely. When Midford inspected the damage, he was stunned it hadn't fallen. His verdict was simple. The safety of the fort was entirely due to gunnery. Sewell and Lapthorne were sent to Bombay under arrest. Ince remained, quietly, without rank or fame. History seldom remembers such men, but we should. The siege of Anjengo ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. When Bombay finally received word of the disaster in July, it was too late to intervene. The rains had closed the seas, and the British Empire, still more a corporation than kingdom, was not known for speed in crises that affected only pepper and pensioners. By October, a rescue force arrived, but what they found wasn't a fort in need of saving. It was a crime scene and a cover-up. Mr. Midford was sent to restore order. What he found was no books, Catherine Gifford had carried them off, no accounts, Lapthorne had claimed pay for the dead, no chain of command, just drunken officers and stores plundered by their own men. Midford did what the company expected. He arrested Sewell and Lapthorne and sent them to Bombay, and the matter ended there. A stern letter, a few lost pensions, nothing more. What collapses first in an empire is not the flag, it's the record book. Midford himself turned out to be no cleaner. Once installed, he monopolised the pepper trade, paid himself from the company's treasury, and drew salaries for 20 imaginary soldiers. Needless to say, he died within a year. And when the accounts were checked, over 140,000 gold fanams were missing. In his place came Alexander Orme, private merchant requested by the Rani herself. Orme restored what he could and tried to follow the money. He reported that Gifford's estate owed the company over 500,000 fanams, and nearly all of it had disappeared. This is a gigantic fortune in today's money. Some say the company's vengeance was exact. The Kudum Pillai's family was executed, the leaders of the massacre hunted down. Others say that this was fiction, an imperial fantasy of justice where none had been served. The Rani, publicly horrified, sent a deputation of Brahmins, wrote to Madras, and promised the punishment of the rebellious elements. The real retribution was never clear. The violence lasted a night, the siege 6 months, but the corruption, the vanishing coin, the absent accounts, these would echo for decades. And far from the ruined court, Catherine Gifford was not finished. She would return, not with a musket, but a letter, not to reclaim territory, but to demand what she was owed. She took the East India Company to court. But that, as they say, is a story for another time.